The morning's peace shattered like thin ice when Officer Reed planted himself directly in front of Mrs. Chen's wheelchair. His shadow fell across her lap as he towered over her, his body language radiating authority and irritation. "You can't park yourself here," he said, his voice carrying enough edge to draw attention from nearby patients. Mrs. Chen looked up, momentarily confused by the confrontation. "I'm sorry, officer, but I have a permit," she explained calmly, reaching for her bag to show him the temporary disability documentation her doctor had provided. The baby kicked, perhaps sensing her rising anxiety. "This isn't a waiting area," Officer Reed insisted, his voice growing louder. A small crowd began to form at a safe distance, their conversations dropping to worried whispers. The nurses at the entrance stopped their chatting, watching the scene unfold with growing concern. "Sir, I'm 8 months pregnant with complications," Mrs. Chen tried explaining again, her hands trembling slightly as she held out her permit. "My husband just went to park the car. I have an appointment in." She glanced at her watch. 15 minutes. The officer's response was to step even closer, his hand resting meaningfully on his belt. "I don't care about your appointment. You need to move now." His tone left no room for discussion, but there was something in it that went beyond professional authority, something personal, almost like he was looking for confrontation. From the parking garage, her husband was just emerging, his FBI credentials tucked securely in his jacket pocket as always. Years of training had taught him to assess situations before acting, and something about the scene before him set off every professional alarm bell he possessed. He slowed his pace, carefully pulling out his phone while maintaining a clear view of the situation. The other patients and medical staff watched in stunned silence as Officer Reed continued his intimidation. Mrs. Chen's attempts to reason with him were met with increasingly aggressive responses. "I've dealt with people like you before," he sneered, thinking the rules don't apply to them. Mrs. Chen felt tears welling up in her eyes, not from fear but from frustration. She had spent her entire career as a physical therapist helping others, and now she was being treated like a criminal for simply waiting for her prenatal appointment. The baby kicked again, harder this time, and she placed a protective hand over her belly. Her husband, still unnoticed, was now close enough to hear every word. His training screamed at him to intervene, to protect his wife and unborn child, but his experience told him to wait, to document everything. He knew that what was unfolding needed to be recorded, needed to be handled through proper channels. His hands were steady as he continued filming, though his heart raced with each passing second. A young medical assistant finally gathered the courage to step forward. "Officer, she's one of our regular patients," she called out, but Officer Reed silenced her with a sharp glare. "Stay out of this," he barked, turning back to Mrs. Chen. "Last warning. Move, or I'll be forced to take action." His hand now gripped his belt, his stance becoming more aggressive. The morning sun caught his badge, sending a flash of light across the plaza. In that moment, Mrs. Chen's husband knew that what happened next would either validate or destroy everything he'd spent his career believing about law enforcement. The weight of his FBI credentials seemed to grow heavier in his pocket as he continued recording, knowing the next few moments would change everything. Time seemed to slow down as Officer Reed reached for Mrs. Chen's wheelchair, unaware that every move he made was being documented by someone who understood exactly how far beyond the law he had already stepped. The line between protector and aggressor was about to be crossed, and there would be no going back. The morning sun cast long shadows across the medical plaza as Mrs. Chen adjusted herself in her wheelchair, one hand resting protectively on her 8-month pregnant belly. The crisp autumn air carried the scent of freshly cut grass and coffee from the nearby cafe. She had arrived early for her appointment, wanting to take extra precautions given her high-risk pregnancy. "I'll only be a few minutes parking the car," her husband had said, giving her hand a gentle squeeze before heading to the garage. As a seasoned FBI agent, he always preferred to ensure his wife was safely at her destination first, a habit formed over years of protective instinct. The wheelchair wasn't permanent, just a necessary precaution after her doctor had ordered bed rest due to complications. Mrs. Chen had initially resisted using it, but her husband's gentle insistence and her own growing discomfort had finally convinced her. Now, sitting in the designated handicapped waiting area outside her obstetrician's office, she was grateful for the support it provided. She watched other patients coming and going, exchanging polite smiles with an elderly couple who held the door open for her. The medical plaza was unusually busy that morning, with staff hustling between offices and the occasional sound of ambulance sirens in the distance. A group of nurses chatted near the entrance, their laughter carrying across the courtyard. Through the large glass windows, Mrs. Chen could see the receptionist preparing for the day, arranging files and turning on computers. She checked her watch. Still 20 minutes until her appointment. Her husband was taking longer than usual to park, but the garage had been particularly full when they arrived. A police cruiser pulled up to the curb, its presence drawing curious glances from passersby. Mrs. Chen thought nothing of it at first. The medical plaza often had security personnel around. She pulled out her phone to send a quick text to her mother, who had been anxiously awaiting updates about every appointment. The sound of heavy footsteps approaching made her look up. Officer Reed, as his nameplate would later reveal, was walking toward the entrance, his face set in a hard expression. He had been called to handle a disturbance on the other side of the plaza, but something about Mrs. Chen's presence in the handicapped area seemed to catch his attention. What started as a routine morning was about to become anything but ordinary. Mrs. Chen's husband, making his way back from the parking garage, would soon witness a scene that would shake their faith in authority and set in motion a chain of events that would change not just their lives, but an entire department's approach to public service. In the distance, a flock of birds took flight, startled by the sound of an approaching siren. The morning sun continued its climb, unaware that it was about to illuminate one of the most significant moments in the medical plaza's history, a moment that would raise questions about power, accountability, and the true meaning of protect and serve. No one in the plaza that morning, from the chatting nurses to the elderly couple, could have predicted how the next few minutes would unfold. But Mrs. Chen's husband, with years of FBI training and experience, was about to put those skills to use in a way he never imagined would be necessary. The moment Officer Reed's hands gripped the wheelchair handles, everything changed. Mrs. Chen felt the sudden jerk as he began pushing her away from the designated waiting area, her heart racing as her carefully chosen spot near the clinic entrance disappeared behind her. Her phone slipped from her trembling fingers as she tried to hold onto her bag. "Stop, please," she pleaded, one hand protectively cradling her pregnant belly. "You're hurting me." The wheels caught on a small crack in the sidewalk, causing the chair to jolt violently. Several onlookers gasped, and an elderly man stepped forward to intervene but was warned back by Officer Reed's stern glare. Her husband watched from his strategic position, his FBI training warring with his instincts as a spouse. His phone captured everything. The unnecessary force, the growing crowd of witnesses, the look of distress on his wife's face. His hands remained steady even as his jaw clenched tight enough to hurt. "I said move, and you didn't listen," Officer Reed growled, his voice carrying across the now silent plaza. When Mrs. Chen reached for her fallen phone, he knocked her hand away with enough force to leave a red mark. "Don't even think about it," he warned, misinterpreting her movement as resistance. The medical staff inside the clinic had noticed the commotion. Two nurses rushed outside, their faces showing a mix of concern and disbelief. "This is completely unnecessary," one of them called out. "She's our patient." Officer Reed's response was to pull Mrs. Chen's wheelchair around sharply, causing her to cry out in pain and fear. The baby kicked frantically inside her, responding to her distress. Tears streamed down her face, not from the physical pain, but from the helplessness of her situation. Her husband had seen enough. Still recording, he began walking purposefully toward the scene, his free hand reaching for his FBI credentials. He could hear his wife's quiet sobs, see the smug satisfaction on Officer Reed's face, and noticed the growing anger in the crowd of onlookers. One of the clinic security guards had finally emerged, radio in hand, calling for backup. The morning sun cast harsh shadows across the scene, highlighting the tears on Mrs. Chen's face and the sweat beading on Officer Reed's forehead. "You can't do this," Mrs. Chen whispered, her voice shaking but determined. "This is wrong." She tried once more to reach for her phone, hoping to call for help, but Officer Reed's grip on her shoulder tightened painfully. The plaza had become eerily quiet, save for the sound of approaching sirens in the distance. Even the birds seemed to have stopped their morning songs. Time seemed to slow as Mrs. Chen's husband covered the final few steps toward the scene, his heart pounding but his mind clear. Officer Reed was so focused on asserting his authority over a pregnant woman in a wheelchair that he failed to notice the well-dressed man approaching from behind. Phone recording steady in one hand, FBI badge ready in the other. The morning breeze carried the sound of more police sirens getting closer, but these were responding to the clinic security guard's call, not coming to support Officer Reed's abuse of power. The next few moments would change everything. Careers would end, policies would change, and a powerful message about accountability would echo through the department. But right now, as Mrs. Chen's husband prepared to announce his presence, all that mattered was putting an end to this abuse of power and ensuring his wife and unborn child were safe. The tension in the air was thick enough to cut with a knife as he took one final step forward, ready to transform from silent witness to active protector. The morning sun glinted off his FBI badge as he prepared to speak, and Officer Reed remained completely unaware that his entire world was about to change. "Federal Bureau of Investigation," Mrs. Chen's husband announced clearly, his voice cutting through the tense atmosphere like a knife. "Step away from my wife." He held his badge high, his other hand still steadily recording every moment. Officer Reed froze, his grip on the wheelchair loosening as the words registered. The crowd's collective intake of breath was audible in the morning air. Officer Reed's face transformed from aggressive confidence to shocked realization in the span of a heartbeat. His hands dropped away from the wheelchair as if it had suddenly become electrified. Two police cruisers pulled into the plaza, responding to the security guard's call. Their lights painted the scene in alternating red and blue. The arriving officers took in the situation quickly, their colleagues standing over a crying pregnant woman in a wheelchair, a man holding up an FBI badge, and a crowd of witnesses with phones recording everything. Mrs. Chen's husband maintained his professional composure, though his voice carried the weight of controlled anger. "I've documented everything that's happened here," he said, addressing both Officer Reed and the newly arrived officers. "I'd like to speak with a supervisor immediately." The senior officer from one of the backup units stepped forward, quickly taking control of the situation. "Sir," he addressed Mrs. Chen's husband respectfully, "we'll need statements from everyone involved." He turned to Officer Reed, whose face had drained of all color. "Officer Reed, step aside, please." Medical staff rushed to Mrs. Chen's side, checking her condition. The baby had been kicking frantically during the confrontation, and her blood pressure was visibly concerning to the attending nurse. Her husband wanted nothing more than to comfort her, but he knew the importance of handling this correctly, professionally. "I'm calling the chief directly," the senior officer said quietly, pulling out his phone. Meanwhile, Officer Reed stood frozen, his earlier bravado completely evaporated. The weight of his actions was finally sinking in as he watched his colleagues secure the scene and begin taking witness statements. Mrs. Chen's husband approached the senior officer, speaking in low, measured tones. "I want to be clear," he said, "this isn't just about my wife. How many others has he treated this way who didn't have someone watching?" The officer nodded gravely, understanding the larger implications. The clinic director had emerged, immediately offering her office as a private space for statements to be taken. The morning sun now streamed fully into the plaza, illuminating the tear tracks on Mrs. Chen's face and the shame on Officer Reed's. "Your badge and gun," the senior officer told Reed quietly but firmly. The disgraced officer complied without a word. his hand shaking slightly as he handed over his equipment. Internal Affairs would be notified within the hour, and an investigation would begin before lunch. Mrs. Chen's husband finally knelt beside her wheelchair, taking her hand gently. "Are you okay?" he asked softly, his professional demeanor cracking slightly as concern for his wife and unborn child took precedence. The medical staff had already arranged for her to be taken directly to an examination room. The plaza began to return to its normal rhythm. Though the morning's events had left an indelible mark, witnesses shared contact information with the investigating officers, eager to ensure justice would be served. The security cameras that had captured everything were already being accessed by technical staff. As Mrs. Chen was wheeled into the clinic for her now urgent checkup, her husband watched Officer Reed being escorted to one of the waiting patrol cars. This wasn't about revenge or personal satisfaction. It was about accountability and ensuring that power was never again abused in this way. The incident would spark changes that would ripple through the entire department, but for now, all that mattered was ensuring the safety and well-being of a mother and her unborn child. The morning sun continued its climb into the sky, witnessing the first steps toward justice and reform. The Internal Affairs Office buzzed with focused energy in the days following the incident. Investigators pored over the footage, not just from that morning, but from years of Officer Reed's patrol camera recordings. The truth they uncovered was more troubling than anyone had initially suspected. "Take a look at this," one investigator said to their supervisor, pointing at their computer screen. Another complaint from 6 months ago showed a pattern. Another disabled citizen, another abuse of power. The file had been quietly buried, the complaint dismissed without proper investigation. The FBI's involvement, through Mrs. Chen's husband, meant this investigation would be different. His recording of the incident had already been viewed by the police chief and mayor's office. The crisp, clear footage left no room for doubt or misinterpretation. Medical records arrived from the clinic, detailing the stress-induced complications Mrs. Chen experienced. Her doctor's report was damning. Elevated blood pressure, signs of distress in the baby, and bruising on her shoulder where Officer Reed had grabbed her. Each piece of evidence added another layer to the case. Witnesses from the medical plaza came forward one after another. The elderly couple who had held the door for Mrs. Chen earlier that morning. The nurses who had tried to intervene. The security guard who made the emergency call. Their statements painted a consistent picture of unnecessary aggression and abuse of authority. The clinic's security cameras provided additional angles of the incident. Technical experts enhanced the footage, syncing it with audio recordings from various sources. In the security office, investigators watched the events unfold from multiple viewpoints, their faces growing grimmer with each replay. "Look at his body language here," noted one expert, freezing a frame. Complete disregard for her medical condition. Another investigator added more notes to an already thick file. They had discovered similar incidents in Officer Reed's history, all involving vulnerable citizens, all previously overlooked. Mrs. Chen's husband provided his own detailed statement, his FBI training evident in his precise documentation of events. His recording became a textbook example of proper evidence gathering, steady, clear, and comprehensive. During his interview, he remained professional but passionate about the need for systemic change. The police chief called an emergency meeting with department heads. "This isn't just about one officer," he declared, spreading photos and reports across the conference table. "We need to examine every complaint filed in the past 5 years. Every single one." The room fell silent as the implications sank in. The investigation expanded beyond Officer Reed, who had dismissed the previous complaints. Why weren't red flags caught earlier? Each answer led to more questions, revealing cracks in the system that had allowed such behavior to continue unchecked. Support poured in from unexpected places. Other officers came forward, speaking about incidents they had witnessed but felt powerless to report. Community leaders offered statements about similar encounters. The investigation was becoming a catalyst for long overdue change. In the evidence room, boxes of complaints were pulled from storage. Each folder told a story, of voices unheard, of power unchecked, of trust broken. The investigation team worked long hours, determined to uncover the full scope of the problem. Local news caught wind of the story, but Mrs. Chen's husband insisted on privacy for his family, while supporting a broader discussion about police accountability. His dual perspective as both FBI agent and affected family member added weight to the ongoing investigation. As the sun set each day on the Internal Affairs Office, the team knew their work would have lasting impact. This wasn't just about punishing one officer. It was about fixing a broken system. The evidence mounted, the interviews continued, and the path toward real change became clearer with each passing hour. The police department's largest conference room was packed that morning. The police chief stood at the podium, his face etched with determination as he addressed not just his officers, but also the press and community leaders who had gathered for this crucial announcement. Today, he began, his voice firm, "We're taking unprecedented steps to address serious issues within our department." Behind him, a screen displayed statistics from the internal investigation, numbers that told a story of systemic problems that could no longer be ignored. Officer Reed sat in the back row, no longer in uniform, as the chief detailed the findings against him. The evidence was overwhelming. 12 previously buried complaints, 23 documented incidents of excessive force, and a pattern of targeting vulnerable citizens that stretched back through his career. "We're announcing immediate termination," the chief continued, "along with criminal charges." The room remained silent, but the tension was palpable. This wasn't just about one officer anymore. It was about changing an entire culture. In the front row, the head of Internal Affairs presented their broader findings: problems with complaint procedures, gaps in oversight, and failures in the early warning system that should have flagged troubling behavior. Each revelation led to a new policy announcement, a new commitment to change. The department unveiled a comprehensive reform package: enhanced disability awareness training, mandatory body camera reviews, and a new civilian oversight committee. The changes were sweeping, touching every aspect of police operations. Community leaders stepped forward to share their perspectives. The elderly couple from the medical plaza spoke about what they witnessed. Other victims of Officer Reed's past misconduct finally had their voices heard. Each story added weight to the necessity of these reforms. Mrs. Chen's husband, still maintaining his family's privacy, provided a written statement that was read aloud. His words carried the unique weight of someone who understood law enforcement from the inside, while experiencing its failures as a citizen. His call for accountability resonated throughout the room. The press asked tough questions, but for once, the department had real answers: concrete policies, specific timelines, and clear consequences for future violations. The chief's commitment to transparency was evident in every response. Officer Reed's former partners were reassigned for retraining. Supervisors who had ignored complaints were demoted or resigned. The ripple effects touched every corner of the department, from patrol schedules to promotion criteria. In the weeks that followed, the changes began taking shape. New training programs launched, focusing on real scenarios and community interaction. Officers participated in disability awareness workshops led by community members, including some who had filed complaints in the past. The Civilian Oversight Committee held its first meeting, reviewing body camera footage and complaint procedures. Their fresh perspective brought new insights to old problems, helping bridge the gap between police and community. Officer Reed's criminal case moved forward, with multiple charges filed. His court appearances drew attention not for their sensationalism, but for their role in demonstrating that no one was above the law, not even those sworn to uphold it. The department's new policies became a model for other cities. Police chiefs from across the country called to learn more about the reforms. What had started as a crisis was transforming into an opportunity for widespread positive change. As the sun set on another day of implementation and reform, the chief stood at his office window, watching his officers interact with the community below. The changes weren't easy, but they were necessary. The department was becoming what it should have been all along, true protectors of all citizens, regardless of their circumstances. 6 months after that fateful morning at the Medical Plaza, the city council chamber was filled to capacity. Mrs. Chen sat in the front row, her healthy 3-month-old baby sleeping peacefully in a carrier beside her. Her husband stood at the podium, preparing to address the gathered crowd about the changes their experience had sparked. The room fell silent as he began to speak. "What happened that day wasn't just about my family," he said, his voice carrying clearly through the chamber. "It was about every person who ever felt powerless in the face of authority, every voice that went unheard, every complaint that was ignored." In the audience, familiar faces nodded: the medical staff from the plaza, the elderly couple who had witnessed everything, community leaders who had supported the reforms. Each person represented a thread in the tapestry of change that had been woven over the past months. The police chief stepped forward to present the latest statistics. Complaints were down by 60%. Response times for calls involving disabled citizens had improved dramatically. The new training programs were showing measurable results in officer-citizen interactions. A young officer, fresh from the reformed training program, shared her perspective. "We're learning to see every interaction as an opportunity to build trust," she explained. "The new disability awareness training isn't just about rules. It's about understanding and empathy." The Civilian Oversight Committee presented their first semi-annual report. They had reviewed hundreds of body camera videos, evaluated dozens of complaints, and worked closely with officers to improve community relations. Their work was creating real, measurable change. Mrs. Chen listened as community members shared their recent experiences with police. Stories of respectful interactions, of officers taking time to understand situations before acting, of a department truly serving its community. Each story validated the difficult journey of the past months. The baby stirred, and Mrs. Chen smiled as she gently rocked the carrier. This child, who had experienced that terrible morning from within the womb, would grow up in a city where law enforcement truly protected and served all its citizens. Her husband concluded his speech by announcing a new initiative, a partnership between the FBI and local police departments to share best practices in community policing and accountability. What had started as a personal trauma was transforming into a model for nationwide change. The reforms had attracted attention from other cities. Police chiefs and civic leaders frequently visited to study the new procedures and training programs. The incident that could have torn the community apart had instead become a catalyst for unity and improvement. Former Officer Reed's case had concluded with a conviction, but the focus wasn't on punishment. Instead, his case was used in training sessions across the country as an example of how oversight failures could lead to systemic problems, and how those problems could be prevented. As the meeting concluded, people gathered in small groups, sharing ideas and experiences. The atmosphere was one of hope and commitment to continued progress. The police chief chatted with community leaders, while new officers interacted easily with citizens they were sworn to protect. Mrs. Chen's husband joined his family, reaching down to touch his sleeping child's hand. The baby grabbed his finger reflexively, a simple gesture that reminded everyone present of what really mattered, creating a safer, more just world for the next generation. The setting sun cast long shadows through the chamber windows, but unlike the shadows of that morning 6 months ago, these were reminders of how far they'd come. The city had transformed a moment of darkness into an ongoing source of light and hope for communities everywhere.